parts of V1, right? Is that correct? So,
right, exactly.
So it would just sort of be smeared in that there, like you mentioned, that the average would be across all voxels approximately the same, right?
Right. No, that's exactly right. This absolutely requires V1 to be tuned to, V1 to have preferences for particular orientations. So if you try to do the same thing, and there's actually a figure in the Kamitani Tong paper that shows that. If you try to do the same thing in a higher level area, such as V4, which is tuned to stuff, like, probably kind of more forms and shapes and things like that, but not really tuned to orientations, you won't work very well. So it'll only work if there is actually orientation sensitivity in the area that you're looking at. And then the other thing that it requires is that you not have absolutely uniform orientation sensitivity in every single voxel. Although, you know what, actually, if you did have well, then if you had absolutely uniform orientation sensitivity in every single voxel, then you wouldn't get any pattern differences, that all of them would go up and down together, and then you could maybe, just look at average intensity, but you wouldn't get any pattern effects because they would all it'd be as if you, instead of sampling 1,000 different people, if your opinion poll, you just ask the same person 1,000 times. It wouldn't tell you anything. But yeah, unless there's some fundamental orientation sensitivity that you're sampling from in the first place, this ain't going to work. And so for even in a visual area, if it's a high-level visual area, they don't really care as much about orientation. So then it doesn't work as well in those, and it wouldn't work at all if you sampled from some area like auditory cortex or something like that. So armed with this, let's try and unpack a little bit this rather less clear picture here. And to the people who said, this picture is not very clear, first of all, thank you for saying that, because first of all, I agree with you, and second of all, even if I didn't agree with you, it would still be a very useful thing to know, because what I need to know is, which are the things that kind of need more explanation, and it's not always easy to figure that out from someone else's point of view. So, okay, so here's the kind of less clear version of what we just saw. So imagine you have imagine you could record from a single cell, okay, which you can't with fMRI, not even close, not even by orders of magnitude close, okay, but you can with an electrode and Hubel-Wiesel stuff. So this is kind of basically a replotting of the sort of thing that you would see if you were Hubel and Wiesel and you were recording from single cells with an electrode. So here's a cell which is tuned to 45 degrees. So this is a picture of the different stimuli. Is this too small to see? I don't know. So different orientations, and it kind of has peak responsiveness to this guy here. So this cell really likes this kind of orientation. Okay? So if you could, and here's a different one that really likes this kind of orientation. So if you could record from individual cells, then you would be in very good shape for knowing which orientation was present in front of someone's eyes, but we can't do that. So instead, you say, well, let me record from lots and lots of different voxels, and remember how, because of this kind of uneven sampling of the underlying swirly-woolly map, each voxel, it's not like that each voxel is tuned to an orientation, okay? So, even this voxel, which kind of really seems to have more of the green stuff going on and less of the blue stuff, it's not that this is a green-tuned voxel. And I just would like to repeat, this is not the color green, but this is kind of, just a visual way of illustrating particular orientation. So it has, it actually kind of responds to everything, but just responds a little bit more to these guys and a little bit less to these guys. Okay? So life would be easy if we had voxels that responded like single cells like this, but we don't. Instead, we have voxels that sort of respond a bit more to some things and a bit less to other things, but we have a lot of them. Okay? And so this kind of flattish but not completely flat line is indicating that it responds, the voxel, say voxel number 50 in this case, responds somewhat to this orientation, maybe a little bit more to this orientation. And these vertical lines are error bars giving an indication of how much variability is. And you can see that there's tons of variability, because fMRI is noisy. So, but even despite the fact that there's tons of variability, on average, you're going to get a little bit more response maybe to this orientation than you would to this orientation. And then some other voxel has a slightly different pattern of responses. Okay? So life would be easy if you had this, but we don't have that. Instead, we have lots of kind of very loosely, very weakly, noisy, slightly preferring one orientation to the others voxels. But if you say, okay, classifier, I would like you to tell me whether the person is looking at this orientation or this orientation. So, in this case, this would be called 45 degrees, and this would be 135 degrees. Then you say, okay, well, when I show the 45-degree orientation, then all the voxels kind of light up to some degree, but some of them tend to become a little bit more active. So here's a little picture showing that this guy is kind of a bit more active for 45 degrees. This one's a bit less active. And then remember how we were talking about you assign weights to particular dimensions? So we had this example of is someone a sumo wrestler or a basketball player, and height is I really should change that axis to mass rather than weight. But so height is somewhat informative. Their body mass is somewhat informative, but the kind of combination of them is what's really informative. So similarly with here, so you might say, okay, it turns out that when in your training data, say, okay, now I know from my training, I'm going to tell my classifier, okay, right now the person is seeing a 45-degree grating, and they're seeing something like this. So please, classifier, pay attention to what all the different weights are when someone sees this particular grating, and assign, in terms of making a weight mapping between these different voxels and the degree to which they tell me that someone's seeing a 45-degree grating, assign a higher weight to the really active voxels and a lower weight to the less active voxels. Okay? So that's basically what this picture here says. So it says, this W stands for a weight vector. So it says, insofar as each of these voxels seems to go hand in hand with seeing 45 degrees, assign this so much a weight to it. And then similarly in the training, you say, okay, now I'm showing the person 135 degrees of orthogonal orientation, assign different weights to that. So that's what this kind of picture shows. But I agree that this is not really an incredibly clear picture. So then you have lots and lots of different voxels with lots of different weights, and different weights for the different conditions. And then you say, okay, that's enough for the training. Now I'm going to do some testing. Now I'm going to show somebody some orientation, but I'm not going to tell the classifier what it is. And the classifier says, okay, I've got some pattern of activations. Well, voxel number 50 is active to such a degree, but I learned that voxel, in my training, I learned that voxel 50, has a weight of, 0.8 for the 45 degrees, but 0.4 for 135 degrees. So voxel 50 is going to push me a little bit more towards saying, yeah, I think it was 45 degrees. But then voxel number 100 might push you a different way. And then so you just take a weighted sum of the degree to which all of the different voxels are pushing you towards giving one answer or another. And then you say, okay, am I more towards this one, or am I more towards that one? You take a kind of thresholding operation. And then the answer is whichever one you got pushed towards more. Okay? So that's what this thing here that says max here. So you've got a bunch of different weights. Some of the weights say, yes, I think these theta ones correspond to, theta just corresponds to different orientations. So these are the weights for telling me, yeah, I think it was orientation 1. These are the weights for saying, yeah, I think it was orientation 2. And then whichever of those orientations, so you take some weighted sum of the activations across all these different voxels using the weights that you learned during the training, and whichever orientation comes out on top, you say, yeah, I think that's the orientation that someone's seeing. That's my prediction. So theta prediction means the predicted orientation. So that's what's happening in this picture. So my hope is that this picture is a bit less mysterious than it originally looked, but my guess is that there's almost certainly still aspects of it that are a bit mysterious. So please feel more. Are there any more feel? If there's aspects of this that's still a bit confusing to you, then you're almost certainly not alone. Yes?
So you get sort of like a vote, right? So it's saying, I think that this is the orientation.
Right.
And to go back, you showed that they're relatively stronger. Are they bold? The bold signal is stronger by certain orientations. That's what's driving it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You know, in fact, this metaphor of it being a vote is actually a very good metaphor, and in fact, actually, some classifier systems literally have this thing in them called voting. So yeah, it's actually really not that different to a vote. In fact, that's actually a very good way. Thank you. That's actually a very good way of saying it. So, so just as in a real election, lots and lots of people vote, and you kind of tally up the votes and see who wins. It's kind of like that in this too. But there's a difference here. The difference between this and your regular election is that in the regular election, everyone has one vote. Okay? Whereas in this, if we're voting between, you know, is the answer 45 degrees or 135 degrees, depending upon what happened in the training, some voxels, if some voxels turn out to be quite highly correlated with, quite highly active when someone sees 45 degrees, then they get given a lot of votes for saying, yeah, you know, I think it's 45 degrees. So, so the training will assign, so you know, you can think of the number of votes that each voxel gets for a particular answer being the weights that are assigned during the training. So in that sense, it's a little bit like, I don't know, you know, people who have lots of money and donate it all to some action committee which runs ads on the TV end up in effect having more votes because they have more influence. So it's kind of a little bit like that. So yeah, so thinking of it as voting is actually a good metaphor, as long as you bear in mind that the classifier's job is when it assigns weights is essentially to say, I'm going to give more votes to the voxels that are conveying more information. So you could imagine, suppose for instance, and people sometimes propose this, but of course it wouldn't really work. Suppose you say, I'm going to assign votes to people in proportion to how well informed they are about current affairs. You know, so I'm going to give everyone a, you know, multiple choice 20 questions, you know, can you name, you know, the current Secretary of Defense, you know, what's the majority needed in the Senate, blah, 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 okay? And the more answers you get right, the more votes you get. And so this way we have a kind of voter reliability weighted total vote counting procedure. That's more like what a classifier would do. Now that's actually kind of good in a classifier. It's not good with real votes because of course no one would agree of what the right criteria are, and maybe you would have, you know, civil war or something. But for a classifier, that's actually more or less what it does. So yeah, no, I should have actually. I like that. I like the voting metaphor. Yeah. So it's a kind of reliability weighted voting, informativeness weighted voting. So it, you know, just by kind of happenstance, some voxels are going to, you know, really have a preference. You know, not a perfect preference, but like this voxel really does, just by the way that it kind of happens to be sampling, does actually have a little bit or more of a preference for the green color code orientations than for the other ones. So this voxel will get given quite a lot of votes. It will get given a high weight when the question is, are we seeing green versus blue? Right? Whereas some of the other voxels, say this one down here, are much closer to just responding uniformly to everything. So this is not a very informative voxel here. So this would not get given very many votes really for any question. So this would be like someone who says, oh, I don't know how many people there are in the Senate, something like that. Yeah, so very, very good question, thank you. And in case I'm not going on about this too much, there's really no such thing as a bad question here. Because bear in mind, by the way, the very reason this study got done in the first place was because people decided not to just accept what seemed like the obvious answer, right? It seemed obvious that you were never going to be able to figure out what orientation someone was looking at unless you have really, really tiny voxels. And people said, let's try something else, okay? So even if you think you're asking a question which is just obviously out there or obviously going in a different tangent, that's often where kind of insights come from. So do not be too shy about that. I mean, I know it's easy for me to say that. It feels difficult to ask that kind of question. But so, is this picture starting to become a little bit less mysterious? And we're going to go in somewhat excruciating detail through some of the mechanics of how this works in a bit, actually. Any more questions? Okay, so anyway, so then they do decoding, and decoding is basically just what we were saying, that all of the voxels get given some kind of weighted vote as to, do I think I'm seeing this orientation, do I think I'm seeing that orientation, and you can kind of represent that by a kind of nice graphical way of representing that is in this kind of polar plot where you say, for a given orientation, for the actual input being in a particular direction, what's the proportion of the time that the classifier says, yes, I think it's in that direction. So, so so each of these represents a different orientation. So if the classifier got the answer right 100% of the time, then these kind of little spiky things would be completely pure spikes only going along the actual orientation, and you wouldn't have anything going off it at all. But as you can see, they look a little bit more kind of bow tie shaped, or they're kind of thin bow ties, which means that, take this one here, when the actual orientation is this, most of the time the classifier says, yes, I think it's this, but sometimes when the orientation is a little bit off, it says, yeah, I think it's actually this one, and it's wrong, but it's not wrong by much. Very occasionally it says, I think the orientation is this one, and so that's what this kind of polar plot here indicates. So if it gets things really correct, then these would look completely spiky, and if it gets them just totally random, they would look just kind of like circles, because it would just be, all that it would be giving the answer, yeah, it might be this one, might be this one, might be this one, the same amount of time. So the distance out here would be the same for all of these, so it would look kind of circular. And this here is an illustration of this thing that we were talking about the other day, cross-validation. We were talking about in the instance of the voodoo correlations. What's a good way of making sure that you're not kind of accidentally cheating? And the good way to make sure you're not accidentally cheating is, and this is universally done for classifiers, and these days it's done for more types of fMRI analysis, even if you're not using a classifier, is say, split your data into two independent parts. Use one of it for figuring out one aspect of your model, and use another part for seeing if you're getting the answers right. So in this case, you got your training data and you got your testing data. These are just two independent parts, and the way they split it into two independent parts is they scan the people twice on 2 different days, and so they use one day for training, another one for testing. So that as well as helping to kind of make sure that you're not cheating by having independent data, this is also kind of looking at the test-retest reliability. If you're getting the same kind of stuff on day 2 as you're getting on day 1, then that's a good thing. That means that these maps are not just, you're measuring something that's actually in their head and is enduring, and you're not just kind of getting this random answer that varies from day to day. So, and then they also did another kind of quite cute thing. It's really a nice paper. They said, okay, well, this, so far we've just been looking at decoding which orientation they were actually looking at. But what if I let them look at 2 orientations at the same time? So that's this kind of plaid type orthogonal, lines going this way, lines going this way thing. And I say, only pay attention to one of these orientations. So they're both hitting your eyeballs, but you're actually just attending to one of them. Can you figure out which one someone's attending to? The idea being that if the attentional signals are actually kind of enhancing the activation of the attended orientation and suppressing the activation of the unattended orientation, then your visual cortex should kind of look like it's in the state where you're actually only seeing the attended orientation, even though it's actually seeing both. One of them is getting kind of filtered out a bit, and the other one is getting boosted up a bit. And it actually turns out that kind of works. So remember, this is like this kind of visual depiction of how well the classifier does, and the more spiky it is, the better it is, and the more kind of round it is, the closer it is just to guessing. And so these are not as spiky, these are a little bit kind of rounder than the other ones, but it's actually doing a pretty good job. So, and here's a kind of more standard depiction of that. So the black line here is the percentage correct that the classifier gets when you're actually just looking at an individual orientation. And the colored lines here are how well it does when there's actually two orientations physically present, but you're only attending to one of them. And you have to guess which one someone's attending to. And so, when there's really only one thing there, the classifier is getting, like 80, 90%, it's doing really well. When you have these different S's, these different colors of different subjects, when you have both of them there, so you've got a more difficult problem because you're having to kind of battle against the fact that physically both of these things are present, but you're just kind of relying upon the fact that someone's attention is boosting one of them and suppressing the other one. You can actually do a pretty decent job of guessing, of estimating which one they're attending to, so you're getting, like 60, 65% correct, where chance is 50%. So you're doing better than chance, but it's a harder problem, so you're not doing as well. So that's kind of impressive. So that means that not only can you actually decode what someone's looking at, despite the fact that these orientation maps are at a much, much, much finer scale than you could actually measure with individual voxels, but you can even, to some degree, less of a degree, figure out which one is someone attending to. So that's, and another thing that's, yet another nice thing about this paper is that they actually look at that for different areas. So when you're in an area like primary visual cortex, V1, you do quite well. When you get to kind of higher level areas like V3, V4, which don't care as much about orientation, they care more about kind of more complex visual features, you don't do as well, because there's less information there. This goes back to Frank's question. This relies upon the fact that there is actually sensitivity to different orientations there in the first place. Okay, so now we're going to just start looking at some of the mechanics of this. So far we haven't done too much of that. So this is going to be plunging in a little bit more into something a little bit more kind of a little bit more computational. So okay, so this is MATLAB script. Did any of you already download this and play with it a bit? It's perfectly okay if you didn't, but you might find. Okay, we're going to start looking at it, and then we're going to kind of continue looking at it on Thursday because there's quite a lot going on in here. But hopefully this will be good for getting more of a handle on the actual mechanics here. So let's go to MATLAB. Okay. So if you download that, by the way, does everyone have like not necessarily right this second right now in the class, but does everyone have a working copy of MATLAB in some shape or form? I believe for graduate students, it's relatively straightforward to get one just from the university site license, but I think that for undergrads it's not quite as easy. So are there any undergrads who are having problems getting hold of MATLAB? Now you don't necessarily have to have it on your own personal computer. You could also have it, just go to a computer lab, or in the library there's computers that have it. But if there's anyone who has problems getting hold of MATLAB, then either say or send me an email or anything like that. It looks like everyone's okay on the MATLAB front. Okay, so so you can download this and play with it a bit, and just like you kind of played with the kind of more elementary MATLAB scripts that we looked at the other day, this one is a little bit more, has a little bit more going on. So we're going to start looking at this now for, I guess, the next like 10, 15 minutes. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to run it and just kind of show you the pictures that it makes. And then we're going to go through kind of how it makes these pictures and what's actually going on in them. Okay, so it takes a little minute, and then all kinds of pictures show. And so some of these will look kind of familiar to this is essentially, this is totally just copying what Boynton News and Views does, but trying to kind of recreate it and recreate some of the decoding. Okay, so I think for now I'll just kind of show you what the pictures are, and then in the next one we'll kind of go through how you actually make these, and in particular what's going on with the decoding. So it turns out that there's actually a cute trick for the. You might say, well, how do you make one of these kind of nice-looking swirly-whirly orientation maps? Well, there's two questions here. One is, how does the brain make it? And another question, which may or may not be the same one, is what's the kind of easy way to make it computationally? And it turns out that computation, this was actually worked out by a guy called Eric Schwartz, who's the department where I did my PhD. It turns out that, and the reference for that is actually in here if you're interested. It turns out that you can make this just by taking random noise and just blurring it. So you might say, okay, so these colors here represent just every pixel is given a random color here, random orientation. The colors represent orientations. And you might say, well, what would happen if you blur that? Well, you might imagine that everything would just kind of, become some uniform mush. But to me, it's slightly surprising, and I think it's kind of nice. This is what Eric Schwartz and his colleagues figured out, is that if you take this kind of pattern and you blur it, then you actually get orientation maps that look just like what happens in visual cortex. So that might actually tell us something about what's really going on in visual cortex. It might not. That's an open question. So this is how you make these kind of maps. So what this figure does is it says, okay, let's make those maps, and let's just stick a grid on top of it, where this grid is sort of meant to represent the voxels, the kind of big coarse voxels that sample this space, which actually has much, much finer grained things going on. And remember that in actual visual cortex, the voxels would be even bigger than this, and the underlying map would be even finer scale. So this is even not really an accurate thing. But you can see you've got all of the kind of features are present in. It's kind of amazing that just by blurring this noise, all of the features are present. So there's some areas where there's like a nice smooth progression. Like here I go kind of cyan, blue, purple, red, yellow, green, nice and smooth. And some parts you get these kind of little pinwheels where around a particular, like here's one here, like around this spot here, I've got every single orientation all right next to each other in a very tight little knot. And then you also have these things, kind of fissures, where you have this kind of sudden jump. It's like smooth, 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 sudden change, smooth, smooth, smooth. So here's a kind of like simulation, just like totally inspired by the Boynton news and views figures, simulation of what's going on in particular voxels. And then on Thursday we're going to look a bit more at how this gets made, and then you can say, okay, well, to what degree is each individual, again, this is just completely recreating the Boynton thing, to what degree is each individual voxel actually sampling uniformly or non-uniformly? So let's have a look here. And every time you run this, you'll get something slightly different because it's kind of randomized. Trying to get these about the same size as each other. Okay, so for instance, this voxel here, is my mouse, can you see my mouse wiggling around okay? Okay, so this voxel here, just by happenstance, really has a lot of the red stuff, where red corresponds to a particular orientation. In fact, actually, I mean, this doesn't really matter, but the key for which orientation corresponds to which is in a different window here. But for now, it doesn't really matter. What just matters is that different colors stand for different orientations. So so this voxel here happens to have a lot of the red stuff in it, and if you look at the histogram of what's in that voxel, you can see, yeah, it's got a lot more of the red stuff in it. The one just above it happens to have a lot more of the green stuff in it, and so you can kind of see that in the histogram here. So these two voxels here are kind of examples of voxels that actually convey some information about orientation. If I see a lot of activity in this voxel, then I say, aha, it looks to me like the orientation that gets color-coded green, let's say it's this one. There's some information carried by this voxel. This voxel here carries different type of information. So a classifier is trying to tell the difference between between the green colored orientations and the red colored orientations will give a lot of votes to these two voxels. Okay? It would assign a high weight to them because these are informative. Whereas there's other voxels that really are kind of pretty uniform. So, for instance, this one here, which happens to have a lot of kind of swirly pinwheels and stuff in it. Because of all that swirliness, it kind of more or less has about the same of every single different color. And if you look at its corresponding histogram, it's pretty flat. Okay? So this is just a plain old uninformative voxel. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on. If you could actually stick an electrode into that voxel and record from it, you'd get all kinds of interesting things, because there's all kinds of, there's lots. It's not the case that there's no orientation sensitivity within this voxel. There's lots of orientation sensitivity within this voxel. There's, stuff that likes red ones, stuff that likes blue ones, stuff that likes green ones. But because it's a big core screw voxel that's kind of sampling from all of that, on aggregate, the whole voxel doesn't really have much particular greater sensitivity to one thing or another thing. It's just kind of averaging over all of them. So a classifier, for any question that you ask it, no matter which orientation that you're particularly interested in, the classifier would, on the whole, assign a low weight, not give very many votes to this voxel here. So this is kind of a simulated version of the kind of thing that may be underlying the success of the Kamitani Tong model. Now, I would like to emphasize, by the way, it's just a hypothesis that this is what's underlying the success of that model. In fact, it actually is kind of a controversial question, and we can talk more about this on Thursday maybe. It's actually kind of a controversial question, what exactly is driving the success, and it may not be as simple as this. But what's undoubted is that the classifiers do work. Okay? What's a little less clear is exactly what's going on. And that's actually kind of a general statement about this field in general, that you can get some classifier can correctly pull some correct answers out, but that doesn't mean you really understand what the actual neural representations are, or what the actual neural process is, or what's really happening in the decoding. There's still a lot more questions to ask there, even though the right answer can come out. Okay, so that's what happened. We're going to look at the code next week, but so this is just kind of pulling out each particular color, and it makes it a little bit easier to see that some of the voxels happen to have particular predominance of particular colors. So to say this, I don't know if you can see this at the back here, but this little car here is how much green stuff is there in every single voxel. Okay? So you can tell just by eyeballing, except it's a bit small, that this voxel here has a lot of green stuff, and this one down here has hardly any green stuff. And then if you go and look at the actual map, it's just a little harder to see because all the colors are there. But you can see, yep, lots of green stuff here. Yep, hardly any green stuff here. And then similarly, if you say, so if I said, to what degree, say green is, say, this orientation. Okay, so if I say, to what degree is each voxel informative about the presence of this orientation, the one that's color-coded with green, you would say, not very informative, not very informative, ooh, quite informative, not very informative, etc. Right? What's another one that's kind of a clear example? Yeah, so for instance, this top left voxel here has a lot of purple stuff in it. You can kind of see that here, but it's just showing the purple and kind of purple-blue. And here, if you're like, oh yeah, there's a lot of purple-blue stuff going on there. So this is a kind of illustration of the degree to which, if you just kind of pull out each orientation separately, different voxels have different sensitivities. So if I then say, okay, what would the actual activation pattern be across all these voxels for each given orientation, then for a particular orientation, some voxels are going to light up more, and some voxels are going to light up less, and they're going to give different patterns. So for instance, let me make this a bit bigger here so they're kind of next to each other. So so what would be the pattern across my little 4x4 grid of voxels if I show someone the green colored orientation? Okay, the pattern would be this guy here, which corresponds to this, Can you see this? Is this visible? Okay. You know, this one's quite highly active. These ones are less active because there's less green stuff here. So you would get this kind of pattern. Okay? Now, in this particular case, it just happens to be the case that, you know, one of the voxels is super informative about the occurrence of this green orientation, and most of them are not. But for other orientations, you know, it really is. It's really more in the pattern. There's no individual voxel that's really telling you that much. So, for instance, yeah, here's an example of that. So suppose I show this orientation that's color-coded in yellow here. Then what pattern is that going to make? Well, that's going to produce, you know, some activation kind of here, some here, corresponding to the fact that these voxels, you know, all happen to have a little bit more of the yellow stuff going on. So there's really a pattern here. So you can see the different patterns. There's some information in the pattern about which orientation is being present, and in most cases you can't really read it off from a particular voxel. You really have to look at the overall pattern. So you can start to see how the pattern would allow you to some degree to actually do some decoding of which orientation do I think is present. So on Thursday we're going to go through looking at the actual script, the mechanics of, you know, okay, not just in this kind of visual sense, but how exactly would that work? You know, how would you program that? And you know, feel free to download the code and play with it a bit before then, or we're going to go through it on Thursday anyway. But you know, we're going to start to get a little bit more kind of into the weeds. So see you on Thursday.